Hello and welcome to this video. You seem to quite like the last live stream where we discussed Sam Harris and Jordan Peterson. So today we're going to continue analyzing the second half of this interview. We're going to go over in 1.5 speed. Some people said 2 times speed is too quickly. So we're going to be watching this live stream. We're going to go over some of the ideas, which ultimately is about discussing, well, what are their thoughts on religion? Is religion useful? Of course, you have Jordan Peterson arguing for the affirmative and Sam Harris arguing for the negative, the opposition. So let's get right into it and start watching. And in the first period, it was more discussing the utility of religion. Now we're starting off with the symbolism, or the importance of story, and what are the certain a priori categories of truth. So that's just kind of, if you haven't watched the first part, then this is kind of where we are at now.
This is the really tough part of our discussion, I think, is that you want to ground the world of values in something that's true. We could say objectively true, but let's just say true for a minute. And I share that desire. But the problem is that I can't see, and you actually say this in your book, I can't see how you can interpret the world of facts without an a priori interpretive structure. And this is an old philosophical claim. It's not unique to me. It's the claim of Kant, for example, that you can't get directly from the fact to the value because there's an interpretive framework that mediates between you and the facts. And so first of all, I'd like to know if you accept that proposition. And then the second question would be, if you do accept the proposition, then what's your understanding of the nature of the interpretive framework? Because I think it's best understood, at least in part, as a personality, or as a story for that matter. So,
well, I think our intuition of truth, the intuition that there's a difference between fact.
Well, before we get on with this, let's just start off with talking about, well, what he was saying when he says about Kant. And what Kant was talking about, I think he's referring to as a problem of perception. On one side, you have the world, the things in themselves, and how we perceive the world. So there is that disconnect over there. And there's almost this idea against the design argument where you're like, well, all right, we perceive order everywhere around the world, but how on earth are we meant to know that what I'm perceiving is actual order? Or is it not just some chaos that my brain, out of chaos, in order to survive, has evolutionarily provided a framework of perceivable order above the framework of absolute chaos? So that's kind of the question of Kant. And of course, the idea of evolution wasn't as clear back then, but it was definitely something in mind when he was talking about this story. So let's carry on with this video, and that's just something to understand the framework behind what he was describing as Kant's theory.
Fact and fiction, or fact and fantasy. The intuition that we live in relationship to a common reality about which our understanding can converge, provided we're looking in the same direction with the same tools. I think it's certainly deeper than religion. It's not best captured by stories. Even if you could, as a matter of historical fact, point to its roots in story and myth and religion, that's not an argument that it's now in the 21st century best captured by story and myth and religion. I think it is a fundamental intuition to which our sanity, both personally and intersubjectively, is anchored. I mean, to lose a sense of objective reality is to lose the platform on which you can communicate with anyone and or rationally expect anything to happen a moment from now. To think that your memory represents something about a prior state of the world and your beliefs represent something about a possible state in the future, all of this is anchored to a sense that there's a difference between knowing something really and just imagining it, right? There's a difference between perception and hallucination. All of these distinctions are born of this intuition.
Now that's a very interesting point. I'd like to elaborate on it. And there's a few, and the reason why I'm stopping it here is because I think that there's a few different philosophical frameworks that you can attribute Sam Harris's views towards. So on one hand, you can look at it and say, well, what he's presenting is some form of transsubjectivity, and that's a definition that some people use to define objectivity. And what I mean by this is that, well, what does objectivity mean? Let's go back to the problem perception of Kant. It's like, well, all right, what do we mean by objective? Well, on one hand, you can say, well, objectively, this is some metal thing in itself. It is actually some metal. Someone else could say, well, what is objective? It's transsubjective. And what that means is, well, all right, it's objective in so much as everyone who perceives of this metal perceives of it as metal. So there's objectivity as transsubjectivity and objectivity as it being the thing in itself. So there definitely are two perspectives going on here. And I think it's very important when they're discussing to figure out, well, what actually does the objective mean? And in some sense, Sam Harris is moving and pulling out from the objectivity into the transsubjectivity and saying, well, what we're trying to perceive is almost this unity of what everyone perceives together. And it's very important that when we do accept that definition, that we're not actually then making the extension that, well, all right, that thing that everyone perceives as X is actually this thing in itself. That's not the claim. It's saying, well, what everyone perceives as X is what we call objective truth. And that is what they're actually trying to say. So there's a very minute philosophical nuance between those two positions, which we should bear in mind. Let's carry on with the video.
I think we have fundamental intuitions which are either impossible to analyze or can be analyzed with respect to only other intuitions, which we deem more rudimentary, upon which everything else we do as a matter of knowledge gathering and sense making is built. So the intuition that 2 + 2 makes 4, right? At some point you learn basic arithmetic and you learn what addition is, and it's demonstrated to you with objects, and you're shown you take 2 apples and you take 2 more apples, and then you have 4 apples. Look, just count them. The intuition that can be generalized to any 4 objects. Right, that it's not just a fact about apples, right? That this is something that we are clearly designed to have. There are places where it might break down, right? It might break down at the quantum level. It might break down in areas where our intuitions fail. We recognize those failures in science and mathematics by recourse to other intuitions, which again are unanalyzable. But so there is just this fact that we do pull ourselves up by our bootstraps, and that's not embarrassing. I mean,
so what's the difference between and I'm not trying to trap you here. I'm seriously not. So there might be mathematical intuitions, a prioris, let's say. Kant identified time and space as a priori intuitions. Right. But I think there's a third category of a priori intuitions that are in fact stories, or they're
notifying me. I think it should be back on now. But essentially what I am trying to say is that there are differences when it comes to philosophy and psychology. And on one hand, it seems very simple that when they are presenting the idea here, when they're presenting what it means to be the foundational belief, when they're talking about a priori foundation, what is being presented here is actually 2 different things. On one hand, you have the idea that, well, all right, we have the world, and based on that world, what we then have is, well, all right, we can build beliefs on it. There's a more foundational view there, saying, well, all right, as long as we accept certain a priori truths, then what we can do is then say, well, okay, we have a set of a priori truths, we can base off that and develop from that. However, there's another school of thought which then says, well, actually, let's accept the infinite regress. Let's have that regress which goes back into infinity. So instead of grounding in some certain foundations, as long as we can have that infinite regress and grant the infinite regress, then we can kind of develop a framework of epistemology from that. So I think that there's a few different structures of how a priori truths work together. And also it represents a few different ideas of kind of how we can interact with the truth and how we can interact with beliefs. That's something which is definitely very important, and something which we should bear in mind, is that even though they seem to be accepting the existence of these a priori frameworks, it's very important that you try to justify it and actually try to develop it further from just saying, well, all right, let's accept some foundations, and that's not actually a commonly accepted foundation. It might be one of the most common ones, but it's not definitely the be all and end all, or the only way in which you can approach epistemology. Let's carry on.
Personalities or stories. So let me give you an example. So I'm going to do a quick rereading of the moral landscape. So because, see, you talk about G.E. Moore's argument of infinite regress. If you claim that something's good and you equate it with something, you can also ask infinitely why the thing you're equating it with is good. Now, it seems to me that the way that you step out of that argument, and correct me if I'm wrong here, is you tell a story. I'm not trying to be smart about that. You tell 2 stories. You tell a story about someone who has an absolutely terrible life. They're in a jungle where nature is trying to kill them all the time. And while they're trying to be killed by nature, while nature is trying to kill them all the time, horrible barbaric thugs are making their life miserable in every possible way. Okay, so that's one pole, let's say. And then another pole, you identify, and these are hypotheticals, so I guess they're fictions. That's one way of thinking about it, even though they're extracted from real situations. They're meta-fictions, they're meta-truths. That's another way of thinking about it. You contrast a good life, and that's a life where the person has enough to eat and enough shelter, and they have the things that you would expect people to want. You say this is a bad life, and you say this is a good life. And then you say and then you make a side move, which I would say is that that's an objectively verifiable fact. I would say, I don't think it is an objectively verifiable fact. I think it's a fundamental moral claim. And I think that's where you put your stake in the ground. And I would say, when I read that, I thought, well, if you take your jungle story, which you've extracted from a bunch of horrors and compiled, and you take your positive story, which you've extracted from a bunch of horrors, or a bunch of quasi-utopias, let's say, and compiled, you're 2/3 of the way to a landscape of hell and heaven.
Right.
Well, so then why not continue the abstraction and say, look, what we're really trying to avoid here is hell.
Oh, yeah.
What we're really trying to move towards is heaven. Yeah, but well, as soon as you do that, you're in a religious landscape.
No, but my name for hell is... It's very interesting because, like, you and I were talking about this at dinner. We were talking about this at dinner and how the overlap or lack of overlap between our audiences. And so, like, I just heard from your audience there, and...
You might have heard from the odd convert.
But what's amazing to me is, so, like, I have to do some work to figure out what point they think you made. Because,
wait a second.
Wait, no, hold on.
No. I said if you're going to produce a fiction, why not go right to the end? Because you did produce a fiction.
You can tell stories by way of communicating certain ideas. I mean, that's obviously, I'm not saying stories aren't incredibly powerful and useful and inevitable, right? It's like we
wait. I think you are. You might not be saying that they're not inevitable, but you are debating their utility and power because you said that you don't need the story as an intermediary.
So now we have a few doors open here, which I think we should extract the most out of the areas that we've touched and not run on something else. So
okay.
I
think what is very interesting here, and I think I agree with Sam Harris on this point, is just saying, well, actually, what are we viewing as a story? Because on one hand, Jordan Peterson is saying, well, all right, there's a few different a priori frameworks. There's one which could be a mathematical truth, and one which could be perhaps some way to perceive the world. And then, of course, you have the story as your third kind. Well, that's a different assumption, because when you're saying, well, let's let the story be a further a priori form of understanding, well, I think what you're looking at here is that, well, actually, a story doesn't provide you with an a priori set of propositions. What it does provide you is analogy for a set of propositions. For example, when you're looking at the Old Testament, and this is what Jordan Peterson actually does, is that when you're looking at the Old Testament, his analysis of the Old Testament text, what you then get is actually him analyzing the framework for its underlying propositions. And this entire Genesis series is to try to reduce or actually expand upon the story in Genesis to find its underlying propositions. And in some sense, then you realize that a story is not its independent framework, but rather just a representation for its underlying propositions. So yes, Jordan Peterson is correct in saying that, well, a story is important, but that story is only important in so much as it presents its underlying propositions, which if you get rid of its underlying propositions, then you'll get a problem with saying, well, all right, you don't have underlying propositions, the story loses its value. So in some sense, there is this biconditional relationship going on between the story and its underlying propositions. And then to say that the story is itself valuable without the underlying propositions, then you create a mistake there. And I think that Sam Harris is getting confused by the relationship between those two ideas and those two paradigms. So that's just something to bear in mind. Let's carry on watching the lecture.
I think there's, to talk about the utility of story, right, which is obviously a fact about the world and about human psychology that you're reading a lot into and more into than I'm reading, right? And the people we just heard from love that you...
Well, maybe I'm reading more into it than you are. I'm not sure about that.
But you talk a lot about the primacy of stories. And you were trying to get me to admit that even I helplessly resort to storytelling to make my points, right?
Well,
I think it's a good place for us to, and I don't want to get bogged down, but I think it's a good place for us to touch this topic of the distinction between literal and metaphorical truth, which you might want to introduce it. But I think because that, in my mind, that covers this different emphasis on stories.
Okay, briefly, but we are at 60 minutes, and we had agreed to go an hour and 15 before we start Q&A. So I agree that metaphorical truth is relevant here. Metaphorical truth is my argument that there are some things which are literally false, but if you behave as if they were true, you come out ahead of where you would if you behaved according to the fact that they are false, and so that these things hover in a kind of intermediate space. To call them false is incorrect.
Right. And I hear Jordan wanting to call them true because they're so useful. Right?
Well, but you also look, this is what happens in the moral landscape, I think. Tell me why I'm wrong, because I'm really trying to understand it. See, I think you dealt with G.E. Moore's problem of infinite regress by staking a moral proposition. And your moral proposition was, look, here's the way things can be horrible. And here's the way things can be good. Can we accept that this is horrible and this is good and that we should move towards good? And if the answer is yes, we can accept that, then we can proceed. And maybe we can even proceed with extracting values from facts, but we have to accept that a priori presupposition first. And you insist that we have to accept it because it's objectively true. And I don't think that's correct.
So let me just get the proposition clear. Yeah. So my argument is that the worst possible misery for everyone is bad.
That's hell.
Okay, so hell is the religious version of that, but you can forget about religion or whether there's a God or anything else. That we live in a universe that admits of the possibility of experience. I'm asking you to imagine a universe where every conscious mind, every mind that can have an experience, is tuned to the worst possible experience for that mind for as long as possible. So there's no silver lining, there are no lessons learned. Everything that can suffer suffers as much as it possibly can for as long as it can. Now that includes human beings, it includes animals, it includes future AI that we might build that can suffer, it includes beings that we'll never know about, right? So my argument is that's bad. If anything is bad, that's bad.
Okay, we don't disagree that hell is bad.
If the word bad is going to mean anything, that's bad. And you can't say...
That's fine, but it's not a factual claim.
No, it is. It's a claim about... So I would argue to you, and again, it's hard to impart this intuition if someone doesn't share it, but if someone doesn't share this intuition, I have no way of interpreting any other word that comes out of their mouth after they admit they don't share this. So just imagine someone saying...
But even that doesn't make it a factual claim.
No, so again...
So you guys are going to get stuck here, and I think you're going to...
Yeah. No, give us one more minute.
Okay, one more minute.
I don't think we'll get stuck here. Every claim we make about anything, at a certain point, if you trace all the tools we're using down to, turtles all the way down to something that we can't explain and justify, right? This is true of physics, it's true of mathematics. I just said it was true of arithmetic. Gödel proved it's true of arithmetic. We have intuitions of truth that can't be cashed out by recourse to the system itself. And it's true morally, I would argue, in this sense that, yes, the worst possible misery for everyone is bad. And if you're going to say, well,
Okay.
Who knows? Maybe it's good.
What does bad mean?
What bad means? Bad
Okay,
means that,
again, you guys are gonna get stuck. Let me
It's okay.
okay,
It's okay.
really.
It's okay. What does bad?
So, hold on. I really think that we're gonna go down a rabbit hole here. And
It's okay. This is a
yeah.
crucial issue. It's an absolutely crucial
This is
issue.
why you get stuck.
all right, so we have a mutiny here. We're with a moderator.
Yes.
Give us 2 more minutes.
Yeah,
It's
okay,
crucial.
okay. Well, so let me.
But I mean, honestly.
By the way, I have a prediction that in 2 minutes we won't be any farther than we are now.
Okay, let's bet. I'll bet you.
No, but before we get actually, let's
I'll bet you $1. You're literally playing devil's advocate here because you don't believe that hell might be good.
No,
right?
of course not.
Okay,
I didn't say that for a second.
So you're
I
willing,
agree that it's bad. By
and
definition.
this is I would argue that anything if you're going to use the word bad and good,
Yep.
or better and worse, or make any value judgment about anything, it will implicit in those judgments will be an acknowledgement, whether you're going to acknowledge it or not when I put the question to you, that the worst possible misery for everyone is bad. You can't use the word bad unless you're going to
I'm not
acknowledge
disagreeing
that.
in the least about that.
Okay, so it's built into your good and bad with respect to every other situation in life.
Fine,
You,
I
like,
agree.
if you're going home tomorrow and a bus drives by and cuts your hand off, and you say, well, that was bad. It only makes sense with reference to this underlying claim. Well, it would be worse if the other hand got cut off too, and everyone's hands got cut off.
You're beating a dead horse here, man. I agree with you.
So I'm saying that everyone assumes this, whether they claim to or not.
Okay.
And so to say, and this is how I bring G.E. Moore's argument to end.
Yeah, right.
He says his argument depends on it being intelligible at that point to say, well, is that really bad? Is it really bad? Okay, well, what would really bad be if the worst possible misery for everyone didn't get you there? Right? There's no other space to occupy.
I'm also not disputing the utility of your move to bring G.E. Moore's infinite regress to an end. I'm disputing something very specific. I'm disputing the issue that that's a factual claim. That's all.
Well,
Hell is bad. We should avoid it. It brings Moore's infinite regress to an end. All of that. I agree.
It's deeper than a factual claim. It's just a claim about it's a claim that is required to make any value judgment intelligible.
Right. Any value judgment.
So,
Yes.
so it's not an arithmetical claim. So an arithmetical claim about addition in this case is
Now you're making my point for me.
you could say the same thing. You could say when I say 2 + 2 makes 4, you could say, but is that a factual claim? And there's some way of jiggering the way you talk about facts with respect to mathematics, where I can say, well, it's not a factual claim, but it's an arithmetical claim. It's a mathematical claim.
Well, I'm also not trying to.
I just don't see a need to balkanize our
because I'm
claims
trying
this
to.
way.
Yep, fine. What I'm really trying to do. We need the problem I have with your argument, and this isn't. I don't mean that you're wrong. I see what you're doing, and I see why you're doing it. And as far as I can tell, it's laudable. But the problem is that as far as I can tell, there's problems it doesn't solve, and there's other problems it leaves unaddressed that don't have to be unsolved or unaddressed. And so one of the problems is this problem of the intermediary interpretive structure. And you already said we need intuitions to guide our interrelationship with facts. Okay, so we've already agreed on that. So the question is, what are the nature of these intuitions? And I'm saying some of those intuitions take the place of stories, take the form of stories, but even more than that. So I'm going to go after the hell thing again, okay? Because you said, well, it's bad, and you made sure that I also agreed with that, which I do. I agree with that. And then it's a point of profound agreement between you and I. Like, I've spent my entire life trying to understand why people did the worst things they could possibly imagine in the service of their dogmatic beliefs. And so I think that that's not good, seriously. And I'm no fan of moral relativism. So we're on the same page there. Now, but what I noticed when you wrote The Moral Landscape is you tell it, and I'm not trying to trap you. You tell a story about, it looks to me like it's a story about heaven versus hell, essentially. Let me use that language momentarily. But it's also a story about good versus evil. And this is why. It's because the question is, what's bad about hell? Now, you say the suffering. It's like, fair enough, man. True enough, but not true enough. So in Dante's vision,
What's also bad about hell?
the actions that put you there, the malevolence that generates it.
Okay, but that's part of the suffering. So
No, it's not. No, it's not. It's not the same as the suffering. It's not the having your hand cut off. It's the pleasure that's derived by the person who cut it off. And that is a different thing.
But that's part of my picture.
Well, but wait, it's important. The distinction is important. So for example,
Jordan, my picture of the moral landscape includes all of this. It includes everything.
All right, I think this is a good place to stop this and give a bit of an analysis of it. And first of all, I'll talk about why I think Sam Harris's discussion of the moral landscape is incorrect. And the first one is of course what Jordan Peterson was saying. It's not a factual claim, and I think this is something that Sam Harris fails to answer, and it's something which is quite common in moral philosophy. And of course, it goes back to G.E. Moore's objection, and Sam Harris is trying to say, well, let's stop G.E. Moore's objection by creating this story, or at least creating this common assumption that everyone believes that X is bad. Now, but then that doesn't actually answer the is-ought objection. What G.E. Moore is arguing is saying, well, how can you make a factual claim? How do you make a true claim out of a descriptive claim? It's like, well, all right, this is an iPhone. That's neither a good or a bad proposition. Or this is a pen. This is neither a good or a bad proposition. Well, this pen is suffering. Well, all right, is this good or a bad thing? It's a description thing. Like the sun is sunny outside. I mean, you can see the sun's coming through the window. Is that a good or a bad thing? It's raining outside. Is that good or bad? The same thing goes with, well, all right, is like everyone is suffering. Is that a bad proposition? Now, is that a factual claim? On one hand, you can say, well, it is a factual claim in the transsubjective sense. That goes back to the beginning of this interview. And when Sam Harris is saying, well, everyone assumes that is the case. Well, that is going back to the appeal to the transsubjective. And the transsubjective, as I said, is, well, something is objectively true if and only if everyone perceives such X to be the case. So this is transsubjectively metal because everyone perceives this as metal. And in the same way, perhaps you will have you'll have, well, everyone perceives killing people and raping people to be bad because everyone perceives that those things to be bad. However, you could grant all that and then have this problem. It's like, well, everyone believed the world was flat a few thousand years ago. Does that make the world being flat transsubjectively true? That's another question. And you can say, well, maybe it was true from a phenomenological standpoint, but not true from an epistemic or scientific standpoint. Sure, but now then you have different categories of truth. And well, would Sam Harris accept the fact that perhaps the idea of his good and evil is only just as true as people believing the world was flat a few million years ago, when everyone believed that the world was flat a few million years ago? Perhaps not, and I don't think he would accept that. So I do think that there's a fundamental distinction, a problem with Sam Harris's moral landscape, which lies from this is-ought distinction. How does he make a descriptive case? And what Jordan Peterson is doing, or at least why he's introducing the story, and I think this is the reason for why he wants to give the story the truth value there, is to say, well, actually, given the structure of heaven or in hell, and the fact that what you're perceiving as bad is actually bad, if you give the story a normative value, then, well, you can actually get objective facts about certain situations. Now, the problem there, then, is not about getting an objective story, but, well, the question is, well, which story is the correct one objectively? And then you have more discussions about that. Well, which story is the correct story? Is it the Christian one? Is it the Muslim one? Is it the Jewish one? Is it the Chinese one? Which story is the correct story to describe the world? And that's a more fundamental question, which is something that you have to wrestle with as well. And of course, each Christians or whoever it is will have their own perception of it. But that doesn't change from the fundamental idea that there is something at odds, there is something at struggle, there's some conflict there, which goes beyond merely saying, well, everyone just assumes the worst possible situation is bad. Well, you have to go beyond that if you want to make a solid factual claim about the situation. And I think that is the crux of the argument which is being seen here. And I hope this is the main problem with Sam Harris's moral land. It's the area which I think is causing the most disagreement between the two gentlemen.
And this is why I don't readily answer to the name of utilitarian or consequentialist, because the way those views tend to be taught, they tend to take as in the tally of consequences, you leave out the psychological implications of being the sort of person who would have sought those consequences or behave that way, right? So I would grant you, and this, I'm explicit about this whenever I talk about this, that part of the picture of any consequentialist discussion of well-being is everything about the human mind and social relationships and societies born of all the individuals living together, everything there that leads to different states of consciousness. So it's like you having negative intentions towards other people that give you that produce certain negative actions in the world. Those intentions themselves are part of the consequential picture. Those intentions themselves close the door to certain kinds of positive mental states that you don't have. Let's say you don't have compassion because you wake up every morning just trying to figure out how to manipulate people. Well, not being able to feel compassion for other people is a bad thing for many reasons we could adduce. And yet the usual consequentialist picture just looks at what's happening out in the world in terms of the body count, and that's not it's all part of this picture. We're all talking anything that can possibly affect a conscious mind anywhere is part of the picture that I'm painting, that I'm calling the moral landscape.
Okay, so
I want you to let me step in. I think I can.
We need to bring you guys
get us somewhere. All right, I'm going to start with you, Sam. Let's swap out the idea of metaphorical truth for something a little harder-headed. Heuristics, right? We have heuristics. We use them to perceive the world. They're often highly reliable. In fact, almost everything that you believe that lets you operate has to be a heuristic of some kind. I mean, if you decided to learn to drive and you got into the car and they said, okay, well, it's all quarks out there, right? You need to understand how quarks interact with each other.
Not useful.
Right, not useful, right? But you need some heuristics in which you can stipulate that there's something called a vehicle out there and you don't have to be overly precise about what it is and you learn to avoid it. Okay? The heuristics vary a lot in quality. Some of them are really good. The periodic tables are really good. Okay? The idea of gravitational potential energy is kind of crappy, right? If I have a phone on a table here, I can tell you how much potential energy it has by measuring its mass and its distance from the ground, but if I've got a hole at one depth on one side of the table and another depth on the other side of the table, I can't calculate it because it's a crappy heuristic. Works well enough in regular stuff. Right. Now here's the question. What if these religious texts are heuristics through which most people simplify calculations that they are in no position to do based on the limited amount that they are capable of perceiving, the amount that they understand about the things that are in play? So they're deploying these heuristics maybe to reduce things that degrade well-being. If it were true that religious heuristics increased well-being by allowing people to actually, on average, operate in the world in a way that increased well-being, what would you say about them then?
Well, I would worry much less about them, obviously. And that's why I don't treat all religions equally. The religions I literally never think about because I'm not seeing the daily casualties of those belief systems. So,
but you say that as people get away from fundamental versions of these things, and I'm not advocating for fundamentalism here, but you say yourself, as people get away from the fundamental versions of these things tend to go haywire. And so, in essence, what you're saying is
they tend to go haywire in what sense?
Oh, I thought I was interpreting.
Multiplicity of interpretations.
Right.
Well, yeah, but so people are in search of better heuristics. I think the pressure is some of these heuristics are obviously so bad that there's civilizational pressure to find better interpretations.
But you said that the fundamentalists have an advantage.
Yeah.
What is that advantage?
Because if you just go back to the text and say, listen, I want to understand what these words mean, right? You get at the first pass the quote, literal interpretation, right? And you're not bringing any armamentarium you got from the outside, from other parts of culture to parse the text. You're just trying to, if it's in English and you speak English, you're just trying to decode the words, right? And when it says, if the girl's not a virgin on her wedding night, take her to her father's doorstep and stone her to death, that you know what stone means, you know what girl means, you know what father means, and you're 90% there to an obvious atrocity.
I get the horror of it, and we'll get to that in a second here. But the basic point is to say that the fundamentalists have an advantage is to acknowledge something functional about those stories, which I'm claiming are going to be some kind of evolutionary heuristic for living a life. Doesn't make them defensible.
They have an advantage. It's not an advantage that it's an advantage. It's a mimetic advantage. It's an advantage. ISIS has the advantage when the people who share their interpretation of Islam. It's why someone like Anwar al-Awlaki could make YouTube videos that so many people found compelling. It's because it's totally straightforward. It's like the advantage is, listen, there are a lot of people spending a lot of time lying to you about what these books mean and what the prophet and how he lived, right? You know in your heart that my interpretation of this is correct. You just read the words, right? And there's a strength in that. There's an honesty in that. It's clear when it says sacrifice a goat. Goat means goat, right? Like you don't have to do something else to make goat mean having nothing to do with goat, right? And so that it's an asymmetric war of if you're going to try to make your dogmas more and more palatable by importing stuff that clearly was never even in the worldview of anyone who birthed these religions, you're not doing that because you want to live even more by God's word. No, you found some of God's words unacceptable, right? And every fundamentalist can sniff that out, and they're right to sniff it out because in fact it is in fact the motivation.
Okay, good. So I think we have.
Well, I think this is a very interesting point, and this is why fundamentalism is so powerful. I think this is also why Andrew Tate says Muslims and Islam would be the last religion on earth, and whatever reason you have for that is a different thing. But I think that is fundamentally one of the things, is that Islam does stick to its fundamental beliefs way stronger than any other religion on this planet, and I think that there is some value there. It's almost the idea that, well, people are so sick and tired, and this is the idea about the pendulum, right? If you swing something left enough, it's going to swing back right, or if you swing something left, it's going to go back right again. And in the same way, you're looking at this situation where it's like, well, people are so sick and tired of people just changing everything when the text is so clear about a certain circumstance that they're like, all right, let's just accept it. And when people do it, no matter how ridiculous it is, people would be drawn to it. That's kind of like the Andrew Tate phenomenon. The guy who says some truth says some other rather ridiculous stuff. Well, but he is given what people like, and when you have that situation, people just get drawn to it. And the same goes with this idea of fundamentalism and all these ideas. It's that same core, and it's a reason why it's almost like the people who can hold their beliefs till the end, it's a race to the bottom of how far you can go. He who reaches there first and hold their beliefs first will win. And that's why I think the Christian church was so strong throughout the centuries, was because they held that belief. And now the moment they changed, they lost control of society. So I think that is precisely that which exists, and that is basically what goes on today.
We've got a tenuous kind of agreement that there might be some kind of utility, that utility might be morally questionable sometimes, but that there is some reason that people would resort to a fundamental, simple interpretation, because as they depart from that interpretation, things get more difficult and it creates some kind of disadvantage.
Well, part of the problem with that would be that as you move away from the text, you fractionate the moral belief system, and you end up with a nihilistic situation. So as you move away from dogmatism, you move towards the parallel danger, which is more relativism and nihilism. And so hopefully you can find some balance. So let me ask you.
No, I want to ask you a question.
Oh, yes, okay. Yeah.
So,
and also, what time do we actually stop this part? It's 10.
I just missed the time card, but I think we have another couple of minutes. Okay. So
there's no objective reality to time, I think.
Actually, it's a pretty good conversation we could have. But so here's my question for you: is if we agree that there is some way in which religious texts carry some kind of value because they allow people to figure out how to navigate their lives in ways that might reduce suffering, reduce the complexity of the choices that they have to make, presumably you will agree that would be consistent with an evolutionary interpretation, that the fact that the stories themselves are functional would provide an advantage to those who were deploying.
Yes.
So here's the problem. Isn't it then also true that those stories are responsive to past environments? And so the claim that these things might be timeless would be suspect. And in fact, you would expect a spectrum of durability. Some stories would be right in a brief moment. And okay.
All that's true.
All that's true.
So far, so good.
Well, so far, so good. This is actually, I think, quite excellent then, because what we have is a recognition that there is something to these belief systems that has to do with practical realities in the past. And we also have an acknowledgement that we cannot trust in these things based on simple faith, because even if they can be certain to have worked at some point in the past, we don't know what their relevance is to the present.
Right. Okay. Fair enough.
All right.
And I would say that's two things about that. That's exactly why we're having this discussion. And you see, what happens in the most profound of such texts is the idea that the process by which your knowledge is updated has to occupy a position in the hierarchy of values that supersedes your reliance on dogma is the fundamental claim. That's why, for example, in Christianity, the notion is that the word is the highest of values. And that's the embodied word. And that's the thing that mediates between order and chaos. And everything else has to be subject to that. And I would say that's not a claim that's unique to Christianity. So, for example,
okay, no, I think because we're being told we're out of time here, so I want to give Sam his reaction to that as well, and then we'll move on to Q&A.
Well, I'm tempted to just ask Jordan a question. I mean, it's hard to know what to say for tomorrow.
Well, I think that's a very good point he talks about here, and what he's saying is, well, all right, you can change things, but if the fundamental thing that you're arguing for, and this is what he is saying, is that, well, all right, a belief system has proposition X, Y, and Z, let's just say, and the belief system is based on proposition X, and Y and Z are above it as secondary or tertiary values. All right, so if what you're updating is Y or Z, you still have X to remain or X to stand on. But the question is, and this is a problem that has been raised to Jordan Peterson, it's like, well, all right, why is the Bible still valuable, even though people change interpretations of it and develop it over time? What Jordan Peterson is saying, well, all right, what you're changing is the secondary, the tertiary values, like Y and Z or E, F, G, or whatever it is. But as long as you're keeping X as its foundation, which is important to the truth, well, then you're going to be developing from that, and it's going to develop onwards and onwards and onwards, which allows you to keep that fundamental basis. And as long as that fundamental basis is held, which is the truth or logos, whatever you call it, then you still have that value. So by keeping X there, then you have that value, and then that's a good place in which you can move on to carry on your discussion. That's the value of the text. So if you're changing the fundamental logos, then you have problems. If you're not changing the fundamental logos, you still have your belief system, and that belief system is so powerful.
Tomorrow night, but I feel like we've got 3,000 people sitting here who would really like an answer to this question. You say you believe in God. You have been...
No, I say I act as if he exists.
You say what?
I say I act as if he exists,
Okay,
which is a much more precise claim.
Okay, so then what but in this case, what... So you act as though God exists.
Yep.
And in addition, I've heard you say that I act as though God exists, that I can't really be an atheist.
So far it seems
Yeah,
that.
yeah.
We'll see.
But the night is young.
Yeah.
So in that sense, I'm not really an atheist. I've heard you say this. So
Well, some of you is.
well, if I were really an atheist, I would be far more poorly behaved than in fact I am. Right? I would be like Raskolnikov committing murders and assuming there was nothing wrong with it.
It would be more likely, yes.
Yeah, okay. So
Okay, that's a big distinction.
I need to know.
Be more likely.
What was that?
That's a big distinction. That you would is very different than it would be more likely. Taking the safety off the gun is not the same thing as shooting, right?
Yeah.
The temptations laid open to Raskolnikov would be more at hand.
Okay.
Just as they were to him.
So what in what sense do you mean? What is the God that you act as though he, she, it exists, and what is the God-shaped thing I must have in my life to prevent me from being a quote real atheist?
Well, okay. First of all, I have to point out that there's no possible way I can answer both those questions in 2 minutes.
Well, it's the same question.
But,
I mean,
yeah,
what do you mean by God?
Okay. Well, I'm going to tell you some of the things that I mean by God. Okay.
We do have to get the questions.
Maybe we're going to do this tomorrow.
Yeah, maybe this is where we start. Oh, God. Well, that was a pretty resounding no.
It seems like that constitutes an audience question, wouldn't you say?
All right, I tell you what. Let's do this, but let's be deliberate about time.
Okay. Well, I'm going to read some things that I wrote because it's so complicated that I'm not sure that I can just spin it off the top of my head, and so you'll have to excuse me. So, and what I'm going to do is sort of paint a picture by highlighting different things. So now I already made one point here. I made the point that part of the conception of God that underlies the Western ethos is the notion that whatever God is expressed in the truthful speech that rectifies pathological hierarchies. And that isn't all it does. It also confronts the chaos of being itself and generates habitable order. That's the metaphysical proposition. And that's best conceptualized as at least one element of God. And so I would think about it as a transcendent reality that's only observable across the longest of time frames, the longest of iterated time frames, to your point. So here's some propositions, and they're complicated, and they need to be unpacked. So I'm just going to read them, and that'll have to do for the time being. So God is how we imaginatively and collectively represent the existence and action of consciousness across time, as the most real aspects of existence manifest themselves across the longest of time frames, but are not necessarily apprehensible as objects in the here and now. So what that means in some sense is that you have conceptions of reality built into your biological and metaphysical structure that are a consequence of processes of evolution that occurred over unbelievably vast expanses of time, and that structure your perception of reality in ways that it wouldn't be structured if you only lived for the amount of time that you're going to live. And that's also part of the problem of deriving values from facts, because you're evanescent and you can't derive the right values from the facts that portray themselves to you in your lifespan, which is why you have a biological structure that's like 3.5 billion years old. So God is that which eternally dies and is reborn in the pursuit of higher being and truth. That's a fundamental element of hero mythology. God is the highest value in the hierarchy of values. That's another way of looking at it. God is what calls and what responds in the eternal call to adventure. God is the voice of conscience. God is the source of judgment and mercy and guilt. God is the future to which we make sacrifices and something akin to the transcendental repository of reputation. Here's a cool one if you're an evolutionary biologist. God is that which selects among men in the eternal hierarchy of men. So, men arrange themselves into hierarchies and then men rise in the hierarchy. And there's principles that are important that determine the probability of their rise. And those principles aren't tyrannical power. They're something like the ability to articulate truth and the ability to be competent and the ability to make appropriate moral judgments. And if you can do that in a given situation, then all the other men will vote you up the hierarchy, so to speak. And that will radically increase your reproductive fitness. And the operation of that process across long expanses of time looks to me like it's codified in something like like the notion of God the Father. It's also the same thing that makes men attractive to women, because women peel off the top of the male hierarchy. The question is, what should be at the top of the hierarchy? And the answer right now is tyranny as part of the patriarchy, but the real answer is something more like the ability to use truthful speech in the service of, let's say, well-being. So that's something that operates across tremendous expanses of time, and it plays a role in the selection for survival itself, which makes it a fundamental reality.
Jordan, if I can I just cut in here with one question?
Stop with that for now.
What? So I was not hearing in that list of attributes a God who could care if anyone masturbated. I was not hearing a God who...
Depends on what else it's stopping you from doing, Sam.
Sorry, I missed that.
I said it depends on what else it's stopping you from doing.
Well, okay, so it's
Yeah, but
important to live. It's important to do something other than masturbate.
Yes. Yes, which actually constitutes a problem for many people.
Which is harder than it sounds.
Yeah.
I'm not hearing a God, a personal God who can possibly hear anyone's prayers, much less answer them, right? And so I'm wondering what percentage of religious people who would say, oh yeah, I believe in God and it's the most important thing in my life, what percentage of those religious people do you think have in mind a God of the sort you just described?
I don't know, Sam. It's a good question, because when I go talk to people, when I talk to people online and use exactly this terminology, millions of people listen. So it's not so obvious what percentage of people see it this way. It's maybe that they have the intuitions, but they haven't been articulated well.
I mean, this is the problem. This is what worries me about this. So, you could do the same.
Well, I think this is a very interesting place to talk about, and why I think his own was fundamental. I think it's quite a powerful argument from God and for God, and what this argument is the idea that, well, all right, what we view in the world, what we perceive in the world, there's atoms, there's a physical world. But what makes the physical world something of value that we have use of? And this is a phenomenological question, right? What makes this a laptop stand? Well, I give it value, I give it meaning. Now, all right, you get there, you have the world in itself, the physical world, then you have the world of value, and then, well, but then we know intuitively and we know objectively that that world of value can be split into various levels. So, in other words, the world that I am creating, the world of value, is also a world of hierarchy. So there's a hierarchy of value, just as there exists value over the physical world. And well, what is that value, that hierarchy of value? Well, it's objective. It's objectively the case that me breaking my spoon or me breaking my pen is objectively less bad than me breaking or killing someone, right? So that's the case, and there's an objective order to hierarchy. So there must be this objective order of value. And if there is this objective order of value, then there assumes to be a top of that objective of value, because you cannot have, of course, you can have an infinite level of value, but then an infinite level of value would almost seem to presuppose itself that there is infinite value, which seems very close to God. But if you allow there to be a finite set of values, then, well, the top of that value should be what we conceive of God. And it cannot be in this world, because if it was in this world, then how on earth are we meant to understand it? Because you cannot conceive of something without a foreign kind of a judge. You cannot understand what the math is without a framework beyond it. There has to be a meta aspect of it. So if the value in this world was finite, well, then you wouldn't be able to understand any value at all, because it would not be an objective framework upon the value in this world to be based upon. And then that is what you get God. So I think that there is some fundamental religious structure to it, which makes a lot of sense.
Same thing with the idea of ghosts. Right? So people traditionally have believed in ghosts. It's an archetype, you might say, the ghost. Survival of death is certainly an archetype. And we know what most people most of the time mean when they say they believe in ghosts. And I say, I don't believe in ghosts. And you say, no, you do believe in ghosts. Ghosts are your relationship to the unseen. That's a ghost. So you have a new definition of ghost that you're putting in the place provided, which I have to say, well, of course I have a relationship to the unseen, so yeah, I guess I do believe in ghosts. You win that argument. But that simply isn't what most people mean by a ghost. Most people
can't use that simplified argument about my conception of ghost as an analogy for the propositions that I just put forward.
This is what I see you do. I mean, maybe you have more to say on the topic of God, but this is what I hear you doing with God. You have defined the God that most people believe in, and we know this is the God that most people believe in.
I was asked what God I believed in.
Yes, no, but I'm asking you what percentage. Yes, but you by shifting the definition, you have robbed the noun, the traditional noun, of its traditional meaning, and you're imparting to people.
Wait a second.
I'm not so
what
sure
do you mean by
this.
traditional meaning? Look, it's one of the elemental claims in the Old Testament is that you're not even supposed to utter the name of God, because by defining it too tightly, you lose its essence. And so let's not be talking about what the classical definition of God is here. Okay, it's a historical non-starter. Okay, there's plenty of religions.
Can I check in with the audience? Is the audience all right with us continuing down this road? Okay. So can I jump in here?
You're sacrificing your Q&A.
So yeah, that is at the expense of Q&A. That's what you're giving up. But I think it's probably worth it. So let me say, Sam, I do not believe in a supernatural God, but the God that I heard Jordan just describe, I do not have any difficulty understanding why he might care if you masturbate, and I also don't have any trouble figuring out how he might answer prayers.
Well, tell me more then.
Well, I can tell you how a prayer might be answered.
Okay, but these are
well, it's specific, so you can let me do that.
So it'll be interesting. So I'm not Jordan. We've not talked about this. If I heard an answer from him that actually would satisfy me as to what the mechanism of action might be, that'd be pretty interesting. And if he can tell me what I heard, I think it would suggest that we're not just making up stories here.
Okay, so you might like this, you maybe don't. But well, it's possible. Okay, so imagine that. Okay, so let's imagine that hellish situation that you laid out. Okay, but let's put the extra twist in it, because one of the things that we both decided, I think, was that you also have to build in the intent into that. So let's say the hell that we're talking about isn't the victim of the terrible massacres that you laid out in the jungle story, but a perpetrator. Okay, so someone who's actually acted in a malevolent manner, truly malevolent manner. Okay, or maybe perhaps we wouldn't have to take that extreme case. We could say, well, perhaps you've decided that you've decided that you've seriously done something wrong. Okay, and that you want to get away from hell. You want to make things better. Okay, so here's an exercise you can try. So what you do is you sit on the edge of your bed and you say, okay, what I did was wrong, and you have to really believe this, right? So you've thought about it. It's killing you. It's killing you. So now you're penitent, and you're confessing, let's say, and you're confessing to yourself as much as to anyone. And you say, I really want to know what I did wrong, and I really want to know what I could do to put it right. And I'm willing to accept any answer that will manifest itself to me. Try that. See what happens. Well, that's a prayer that will be answered, and it won't be answered in the way that you want it to be answered. I can bloody well tell you that.
Okay, but that...
Well, what are you communicating with? What are you communicating with when you do that?
That is something that is a process that I'm familiar with. It doesn't require any supernatural explanation, and it certainly doesn't require that we imagine that any of our books were dictated by the creator of the universe.
I didn't say that it required any supernatural explanation, or that it required the book. I was asked to provide an instance of prayer that worked. That's what I did. I didn't do anything other than that.
That's fully understandable in terms of human psychology. And
it's not understandable because we don't know where the answer comes from.
Well, we don't know where anything comes from.
That's true.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah, but that doesn't open the door. I mean, one thing we can know with absolute certainty is that whoever wrote the Bible didn't know either, and there's many other things he or she didn't know, like everything else we know scientifically, right?
It's not so obvious what people know.
No one even knew the brain was involved in any of this, right? So
yeah, but they probably knew about as much as we do about how the brain was involved in it.
But we've already established in some tenuous way that things that nobody understands could have evolved into these stories in some way that would be useful, but nobody knew what they were writing when they wrote it, right? The
problem is that you can. So again, this has been focused through the lens of your attachment to Christianity largely, but Hinduism is a completely different set of stories, right? And many of them, the logic, the emotional logic, the psychological import, many of them have the opposite valence from any Christian story you would tell. The whole notion of, like, for instance, the whole notion of good and evil, right, which has such primacy. I mean, you talk about religion being deeper than ethics because ethics just deals with right and wrong, and religion deals with good and evil, right? Bedrock. Okay, good and evil do not have the same meaning in the East. Buddhism and Hinduism do something very different with good and evil.
I'm willing to accept your definitions of good and evil. For
no, but like, the truth is, it's just not even evil. Is just ignorance on some level. It's just evil is just.
You haven't met any real evil people if you believe that.
Well, okay, so then all the Hindus and Buddhists are wrong about this. That's a possible claim. I'm just saying that there's over 1 billion people who have a religious system of stories from which they derive all kinds of meaning, to which they're mightily attached, to where we could play the same game of archetypal interpretation and valuing, and yet the cash value with respect to good and evil is irreconcilable with what you get from Christianity.
Look, but it doesn't have to be interoperable, right?
But the point, my point is we live in a reality. Presumably, Hinduism is also useful as a set of heuristics for Hindus. And if Hinduism, as a matter of doctrine, and as a matter of the interpretations of the heuristics by the devout in both systems, if Hinduism and Christianity are irreconcilable, right, then there must be a deeper level of reality that explains why they both work. That can't be reducible to Christianity being true or Hinduism being true. Right.
Yeah, look, Sam. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that objection. Like, so this is one of the immense problems, obviously, that actually leads down the road to the kind of nihilism that you were objecting to in the moral landscape. It's like one of the things that Nietzsche said was, that's very much apropos to this, is that, you know, it's one thing to have your belief system shattered by the observation that there are other belief systems that are incommensurate, that seem to have equal utility. So but it's even worse, is that once you make the observation that there are other belief systems that have equal utility, then it can shatter your belief in belief systems themselves. And then you're in the postmodern nihilist landscape, and that's a big problem.
Or you could just be in a more fundamental landscape that subsumes both of those belief systems.
That's fine. Let's hope that can happen. Yeah. But I would say that's the landscape that I'm trying to pursue. Now, you said that that I've been approaching this, say, from a Christian perspective in this dialogue, and to some degree that's true, but there are reasons for that. But I would also say I'm also doing what you recommend doing, because in Maps of Meaning, for example, you said, well, what about this problem of multiple interpretations of the text?
You wrote Maps of Meaning.
What's that?
You wrote Maps of Meaning. I wrote the moral landscape.
Sorry, I must have missed. Sorry, I misspoke. I'm starting to get tired. But what I tried to do, I tried to address that problem seriously. Like, it's a really big problem. It's the problem of multiple interpretations. It's the postmodern problem, is that there's an infinite number of potential interpretations. Okay, so so what do we do about that? And the answer is something you allude to, I'm sorry, in the moral landscape. And it's part of the basis of your argument why these things need to be grounded in facts. So, because that is part of the answer to the problem of an infinite number of interpretations. In Maps of Meaning, I tried to do what E.O. Wilson recommended, but this was before he wrote his book. I tried to use a consilience approach. So I looked at multiple religious systems. I looked at Christianity, I looked at evolutionary biology, I looked at philosophy, I looked at neuroscience, and I looked at the literature on emotion and motivation and the literature on play that was very nicely delineated by Piaget. And I tried to see where there was a pattern that repeated across all dimensions of evaluation, which is exactly what you do, for example, when you use your 5 senses to detect something real in the world. And that's what Wilson recommended, was a consilience approach. And so my proposition was, if it manifests itself here and here and here and here and here, 6 places, and it's always the same pattern, then the probability that that pattern exists independent of my delusional interpretation is radically decreased.
Yeah, my claim, however, is that many of these things don't repeat. In fact, they're flipped around completely based on different religious assumptions in different cultures. And again, I mean, I would just argue this is we can table this for another discussion.
I was trying to dispense with those.
So I'm just saying something as fundamental as evil doesn't run through all these cultures and all these religious traditions.
Then how can you make the claim that everyone would agree with your description of what constitutes bad in the beginning of the moral landscape?
It would be. It's not evil in the sense that it's. There's better and worse. There's better and worse.
So there's either universal moral intuitions or there aren't. Which is it?
Yes. No,
so are some moral intuitions universal?
Yes. No, I would think that, listen, we are just human beings, right? We're human beings first, before we're Hindu or Buddhist or Christian. We all get indoctrinated into the religion of our parents. This is an artifice that's laid on top of something far deeper. That should be obvious. So we're trying to get down to what's deeper.
Okay. So there may be some moral universals.
Sure. I think,
okay, Jordan. Is it possible that there are some moral intuitions that are highly specific to particular traditions and wouldn't translate over to others?
Yes, it's highly probable, because there would be environment-specific adaptations, like the environment-specific tool use of chimpanzees.
Right. Or maybe it's not even the environment. Maybe it's the self-consistency of the belief pattern in question. So
I would put that in the broader environment. It might be a consequence of the particularities of that culture. There would be things that, look, think about it like languages. Like many, and this is kind of an answer to the problem that you laid out, which is a real problem. I'm not trying to deny the problem. If you look at, there's a lot of languages. Lots of languages. Look at how different they are. It's like, yeah, at some levels of analysis, they're fundamentally different. And at other levels of analysis, they're fundamentally the same, which is how we know that they're languages. And you could say, well, there's a very large number of stories. It's like, yes, there are. But the fact that there's enough commonality across the class of stories, the set of all possible stories, so that we can identify what constitutes a story. And I would say that there's enough commonality across.
Now, what's quite interesting here is, and I'll stop it before it goes on too long without me speaking anything, is the idea that, well, there is this fundamental problem between this framework of Christian and Western thought and Eastern thought, because on Eastern thought, there's almost a denial of this good and evil dichotomy, and it's almost similar into the Russian Orthodox tradition. If you read the works of Russian mysticism, you almost get a denial of good and evil. And I'm not saying denial of good and evil as in heaven and hell don't exist. They do exist, but then what they're saying is good and evil, as Berdyaev puts it, is good and evil is almost a pedagogical tool to allow people to get to a fundamental good and evil. So almost there's a multi-layered fundamental nature of good and evil to the world, upon which the most fundamental nature of good and evil is not one of morality, but one of value. And I think that is something which is very interesting and something which has to be wrestled with and something which has to be thought about. Now, on the other hand, of course, you could say, well, all right, what's the Eastern presentation of the good and evil? If there's no evil, well, how do they conceive things? And that's a very interesting thing. It's like when you're looking at the West, there almost is this guy fights a dragon. The dragon is evil and represents that evil. Almost in the East, you have this, well, the guy fights the dragon is wise and good, but you have to fight that as well, because your ignorance of that dragon is the evil, and you killed the dragon in order to kill your ignorance, not to actually kill the dragon. And I think that's a very fundamental point, which has to be thought about and has to be wrestled with, which is very interesting. Let's carry on watching.
Across the set of all possible good stories that we can say, well, here's a canonical good story, which is, by the way, what you do at the beginning of the moral landscape. Because you say, this is horrible, this is good. We should move from what's horrible to what's good. So yes, you've taken a fragment of the universal story and you've made it the axiom of your moral system, which is what you should do. But the claim that I think is not helpful, even though I understand it, is that that's purely a claim of unmediated fact. It's like, no, there is no unmediated fact.
There is, yes, even facts aren't unmediated facts. I mean, you can't judge something to be factual without presupposing the validity of certain intuitions, like that causes precede events, or causes precede their effects. And those intuitions could be wrong. I mean, we could live in a teleological universe where everything's getting pulled into the future by some kind of attractor, right? And our notion of causation is totally backwards. That remains to be discovered, and we would use other intuitions to make that discovery. But again, you do pull yourself up by your bootstraps, and that there's no branch of science or mathematics or anything fundamental, logic, that can get away from that.
Right. Well, that's another place.
But given that picture, that doesn't render all intuitions equally respectable.
Absolutely.
Right? Someone says, well, I happen to have an intuition that Joseph Smith saw those golden tablets and they were, and Mormonism is true. That's not the sort of intuition we're talking about here. Your intuition doesn't grant you insight into history.
What we could say, and this would be an elaboration of Brett's point, is that moral intuitions of the sort that you're describing have different zones of relevance. So there's some things that would only work as an intuition in very delimited areas of time and space, let's say. And there's a hierarchy of moral intuitions, and the more profound the intuition, the more it works as a universal truth across context, just like in a scientific truth. So scientific truth is more profound. This is why the postmodernist readings of Thomas Kuhn are wrong, is that the idea that protons are real is really fundamental, because no matter what span of time and space that you pick, you're going to encounter protons. It works everywhere. And then with moral intuitions, let's say, or moral a priorities, you have the same issue. Some of them are so delimited that they only work here and now. And those are sort of impulsive, low-level intuitions, a whim even. But some of them are really, really deep. The ones, for example, the one that orients you to make the claim that you made in the moral landscape, that the hellish story is bad and the heavenly story is good. Right. I would say that's one of the deepest, most context-independent moral intuitions, which is kind of the claim you make, except you claim that it's
and again,
bad.
back to my fundamental concern here in the difference, with respect to the difference with how we talk about these things, to call that thing God is fine. That's a God I have no problem with, right? But that's not how most people most of the time are using the word. And there's something misleading about that. And that worries me.
Yeah, well, if the claim that you're making is that we're all deeply confused about the nature of divinity and ultimate reality, it's like, yes, clearly.
Well, another thing we agree on.
I also don't disagree. I don't disagree. Look, I've never made the claim that what I'm talking about is like what other people are talking about. I mean, it is in some ways, but I've not made that claim, so I don't see why that's a justifiable criticism. It's like,
well, no, it's a criticism with respect to the very likely effects of communicating in that way. Because I see the results of that communication. It's a little bit. I mean, this is going to sound more invidious than it is, but this is the kind of thing that I get into with Deepak Chopra. Deepak and I agree about a lot.
I think it's more invidious than it sounds, actually.
Yeah. Well, you're not wearing rhinestone glasses. If you graduate to that, we'll have more of a problem. But Deepak clearly wants to let his audience believe that everything they're into is on some level justifiable by his reading of quantum spookiness. Right? So if you want to go out and just buy a lot of crystals and think they're going to heal you, it has something to do with quantum nature of reality.
Absolutely nothing like me.
No, but I think Deepak could say, if I got his back to the wall, Deepak could honestly say, listen, I've never said anything about crystals. Right? I'm not selling crystals. I've never said they work. But it's the way in which he's failing to make the clear differentiation. The fact that it takes you 20 minutes to admit that a lot of the Bible is filled with barbaric nonsense.
I don't think it took me 20 minutes to admit that.
We'll go to the tape on that.
These things matter. These things matter. And
I'm just saying, it's like you.
Look, if you're saying that there's a danger,
if you're in a parish of 1, or in a parish of 1,000, or a parish of 100,000, but not in the parish that has anything in common with the Bible thumpers in my country who think that Jesus is very likely coming back in their lifetime because he never died, and he's going to judge the living and the dead, and there'll be a resurrection and hellfire and all the rest. If that's not the game you're playing at all, own it.
Why are you all applauding about that? It's like, what do you mean own it? It's like, I already made my claim. It's like, I'm not playing a religious fundamentalist game. So what's all the applause about? So I don't understand that. And own it. It's like, I was as clear as I possibly could be when I delineated my answer to the question. So people say, well, what do you mean by God?
Someone once asked you if Jesus was
a 1 second answer?
But no.
Well, forget it, man.
So, I think we can actually.
This is a complicated
1 second. No, I don't want to end on a note of acrimony. But someone once asked you whether you thought Jesus was literally resurrected, and you said it would take me 40 hours to answer that question. Okay, that's the kind of thing I'm responding to here. You don't need to do that if you have a clear-cut answer to that question.
I don't have a clear-cut answer to that question.
And if you don't, that connects with many other things that we still have to talk about.
Yes, definitely.
Yeah, because that
it isn't obvious in the biblical account that Christ was literally resurrected. So it's not simple. This is not simple.
No, but if the question is, do you think let's put it probabilistically. I mean, anything's possible. I'll tell you that it's possible that he was physically resurrected. I mean, it's even possible.
Wait a second. I didn't say that he was.
The point is,
I said it would take me 40 hours to answer the question. I didn't say that he was.
Okay, how's this for an answer? Almost certainly not. What's wrong with that answer?
You want?
I think I know what's wrong with that answer.
It's a fine answer, and people have been giving that answer for a very long period of time, but the idea doesn't seem to go away.
Okay, so that's evidence of what exactly?
I don't know.
Okay.
Well, I can tell you one thing it's an evidence of. It's a deep idea.
Let this be the doorway to our next 3-hour conversation.
Sure.
We have 10 minutes left.
Okay. Well then, let's answer that question in 10 minutes.
So wait, I want you to trust me here. You for whatever reason decided I should moderate, so I want you to trust me. For one thing,
you've been doing yeoman's work.
Sam, I really would like to answer that question. But I'm trying to figure out. People seem to think that I'm trying to evade the question. It's like, I'm not evading the question. I'm trying to figure it out. People have been arguing about this for 2,000 years. It's like, it's not simple.
But that's a symptom of the effect of religious dogmatism for 2,000 years.
No, it's not.
Okay,
it's partly a symptom of that. It's also partly a symptom of the idea.
The resurrection of Jesus is clearly an important question, but you've raised a much bigger and more pressing question for the audience, which is whether or not God cares whether they masturbate. So I actually think if we pursue that answer, that we will actually wrap this up in a way that...
You want to end this on masturbation?
I think we owe it to them, too.
Okay.
So... Give me a little leash.
The floor is yours.
Okay, great. How did I end up here? All right. So here's the question. Let's just figure out if we can determine why God might care if you masturbate. Right. So let's suppose that we have a story, a heuristic.
Well, before we get into that, I'd like to just say that I think he is right in the sense that there is something fundamentally very difficult about answering the question. I mean, I don't really think that Jordan Peterson is trying to evade the question. More so, he's just trying to say, well, there is a fundamental problem here. There's a fundamental distinction. How can we solve this distinction, and how can we really get to the bottom of it? Because every single solution we give seems to lead to some either psychological or physical contradiction or problem. And as a result, the only way to get out of it is through precision and deep thought. And I'm not sure whether Jordan Peterson himself has come to a conclusion. So he's trying to do the most honest thing by trying to slowly talk through his thought process to try to get to an answer which he himself is not yet. And in some sense, by saying I can give a 40-hour presentation or answer on it, is almost like to say, well, I don't know, but in 40 hours of discussion, I might get to a certain direction or a certain answer, and then that is perhaps what is he is trying to get at. So let's finish off this video and see where we go.
Of some kind that stands in for something. And the story is, God is watching. He sees you always. He doesn't want you masturbating, so don't you dare. What happens?
What happens?
Yeah.
Well, it's a rather ineffectual idea. Yeah. Well, I mean,
you don't think that story prevented lots of people from masturbating?
Well, no, but I think the reality was that you had people masturbating and feeling terrible about it, and you had a whole layer of sexual neurosis that got grafted onto human psychology unnecessarily. Okay, and Christianity has a certain typology of sexual hang-uppery, which the tantrics don't have.
So if I understand you correctly, you are agreeing that a certain number of people will have masturbated.
Some of them join the priesthood and rape little boys. I mean, that's all of a piece.
There. Yeah. Let's stick with the topic. So a certain number of people will have masturbated. They will have thought.
Honestly, it's the same topic. I mean, the taboos around masturbation, the taboos around sexuality prior to marriage, the taboo around divorce, all of the taboo around out of wedlock birth, the ideal of celibacy in the priesthood, all of that is just a diabolical machine of needless sexual conflict and misery.
Hold on.
But yes, okay.
You have to take out of there.
How's the whole flood of pornography thing working out for you?
I will grant you that there is some interpretation that takes supernatural principles and magic and otherworldliness out of the equation here that gets you some wisdom in the heuristic. Yes, if you're masturbating all the time, you're not satisfying your monogamous relationship with your wife or husband.
We don't need to go there.
You're not procreating, and
let's just agree that a certain amount of masturbation was prevented by that story, which made people fear the consequence of them engaging in it, which would result in, I'm pretty sure, less masturbation, which means that in seeking a release, which we are physiologically programmed to seek, one might end up looking in a more urgent fashion for a mate.
Right. So it's are we going to enforce monogamy?
No. So look, I'm trying to take you somewhere. I think there's a way that we can rescue some important part of what both of you are saying that can now be reconciled, and then there's a bitter pill for each of you. I mean, that's just the way this looks to me. So if we can agree that this makes sense actually as a fitness-enhancing adaptation, that this story would result in people behaving in a way that might result in them marrying early, might result in them reproducing earlier than they would otherwise, right? Then we can understand it as mechanistic, and we can understand what you said, that maybe God would care about whether or not people masturbate because God is a metaphor for some set of stories that gets you to behave in an adaptive fashion. But the point for you then would be that Sam is arguing with reason we can decide whether or not to employ this story at this moment, whether it's a good idea for us to urgently reproduce as quickly as possible, which, for example, increases the size of the population of the planet, whereas delaying reproduction keeps the rate of population growth down and might be a better choice for a moment in history when we have 7.5 billion people on the planet. So in some sense, what I think I see is the religious story itself makes some kind of sense if you adhere to it in a manner that you are obligated and have no tools with which to question it, then you will miss the fact that at this moment you might want to throw that story out.
The problem is it doesn't make sense, and this is a problem with these heuristics in general, it doesn't make sense for the right reason, and that's why it's not a reliable guide given other changes in the world. But with everything changing, you want to be making sense for the right reason. You don't want it, so useful fictions have to be retired at a certain point. Useful truths stay true. I mean, because they're based on your engagement with reality. And so to take your point about pornography, which I think is totally valid, you could have a completely rational conversation in terms of human psychology and sociology and what you want society to look like about the corrosive nature of pornography. Right? That's not, you don't have to be a Victorian prude to worry that there might be something wrong with the infinite availability of pornography to 13-year-olds and above. Right? I mean, that's I don't know what generation of human beings we're raising in the current environment. It's quite worrisome actually. But again, you don't have to invoke mythology to do that. And I would say the temptation to invoke mythology is say, well, you actually,
how do you do it?
Poseidon really gets pissed off when you masturbate.
How do you do it? How do you do it? We don't have a mechanism. We have no mechanism for controlling
the effects on human relationships and your own mind and your own intention and the way you view other people.
Sam, that barely works for sex ed. It barely works for condom education.
What was
it? Barely works. Like those sorts of educational interventions to stop that kind of fundamental behavior have very little effect. People aren't nearly as amenable to behavioral changes as a consequence of rational educational interventions as you might hope. I mean, and that's part and parcel of very broad clinical literature.
They're not as amenable to dogmatic intrusions either. I mean,
yeah, they are, and that might be a problem. And there are problems with that.
Well, no, because they're, again, this is just.
The
problem is that even if you could make the case that a dogmatic attachment to one or another religion was better, all things considered, than being secular, truly secular and truly rational, right? It's vulnerable. It's vulnerable to every next thing we find out. I mean, that's why it's like, you could have said, if you go back, 200 years before the germ theory of disease, you could have said, well, all of these dietary taboos and taboos around, hand washing and foot washing, it's actually very wise. The wisdom of the germ theory of disease was sort of built into our scripture, and people were survived. There's a kind of differential level of survival based on those who really adhered to these practices and those who didn't. Okay, but it's blind to the actual variables. Like there's nothing special about shellfish necessarily, or there's nothing special about pork necessarily, or whatever the example is. And once you get the actual variables in hand, then the whole edifice comes crashing down, and then you really just want to understand the variables at work.
Look, I don't know if the whole edifice comes crashing down, and it isn't clear to me that you want to claim that, because one of the things you did say in the moral landscape, and I think this is associated with your interest in spirituality, is that there is some baby mixed in with the bathwater. And the question is, how do we distill that out? Yeah. And the objections that you're raising are the objections that are, look how difficult it is to do the distillation. It's like, yeah, absolutely, man. And it's not like I'm a foe of the Enlightenment. I think you Enlightenmentites, and I put Pinker in the same.
I think this is a very interesting point here, and what he's trying to say here is like, well, it's quite damn difficult to stop people from going down this path of sexual immorality without invoking the religious. And I think that's quite true. I mean, how many of you, and I don't know, I'm speaking from personal experience, I don't exactly think the reason why people stop hooking up with people and watching porn is because they've heard it in their sex ed class at school. I genuinely don't think that's very effective. You could tell people everything they need to do it. I mean, it's the same as drugs, right? I mean, or vaping, or like smoking cigarettes. How many people do you know smoke cigarettes or like vape or like do all those stuff today? And well, quite a lot. And how much have they been taught not to do it in school rationally? Quite a lot as well. So I mean, the idea that just by propagating rationality to solve problems is not very good and not very effective in this aspect, I would say.
In camp, radically overestimate the degree that was a casus sui. It's like everyone was barbaric and superstitious until 1750, and some miracle occurred, and now we all became enlightened. Like there was a lengthy developmental history.
Clearly, it all happened. I mean, hence our complaining about the problem. And most of the world hasn't had the Enlightenment yet.
True.
On some level.
Look, I'm no foe to the Enlightenment, but I think that it had a lengthy developmental history that is radically underplayed by the people who ground it purely in rationality.
It's clearly still developing. My point is, we should be able to agree that having a worldview guided by a continuous, honest engagement with reality, insofar as we can apprehend it, is better than having a worldview solidified or anchored to unchanging ideas that were born of people who had none of our present tools, none of our present insights into anything.
Well, it depends on the principles. It depends on the principles. Like I would say, there are situations where that clearly applies, but I think there are broad principles. And again, we should probably stop with this, I think.
Yep, we're about there.
Because I'm starting to get tired. I'm sure everyone else in here is starting to get tired. Well, I'm starting to get tired anyways. And I mean, there are principles, there are higher order principles of the sort that I described that you also appear to rely on in the moral landscape, the idea of these profound moral intuitions.
Yep.
And so that's what I'm after, is what are these profound moral intuitions and what is their source? And like, I'm also perfectly willing to make the claim, and have in fact in detail, that these moral intuitions, see, this is a place where we differ a little bit. It's like, and maybe we can go here tomorrow night. See, it seems to me that for you, your argument is the facts are laying out there and you can extract out value from them. And we already described why you want to do that, because you want to at least not move into the nihilistic direction and you want to ground them in some sort of reality. It's like, fair enough. But the thing is that the facts, as they are, have been around for a very, 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 very long time, right? Let's say 3.5 billion years, the entire expanse of life. And it's the operation of those facts on life that has produced the a priori implicit interpretive structures that guide our interaction with the facts. And those a priori implicit structures that have emerged out of this evolutionary course have a structure that mediates between us and the facts that cannot be derived from the facts at hand. And so then the question is, what is that structure? And it's in both of our interests to get that right, because you use that as the source of moral intuition. It's like, right, agreed, that's the source of moral intuition. So,
well, and clearly we need to table this for tomorrow night, but that's a good...
Yeah, guys, I'm just going to interrupt you. Guys, let's give Jordan Peterson...
Yeah, well, that is it for this video. I hope you enjoyed this analysis. Hopefully you haven't found it too long. Hopefully you found it enjoyable. You hopefully learned something. I will be uploading small parts of this onto the YouTube channel as we go on. Hope you enjoyed this video. If you enjoyed this video and want me to do more of these live streams, more of these reactions, and make sure you let me know in the comments below, or join my Discord server and tell me there about different videos you want me to react to or make live streams of responding to. Hope you enjoyed. Stay safe, my friends. See you soon. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next one. Goodbye. God bless, and have a great day, my friends. See you soon.